This is the MV Ever Given. You might remember it from making the news a couple of years ago when it became stuck in the Suez Canal. Now, this ship is an absolute behemoth, one of the largest in the world. It's as long as 3 football fields, 400 metres or 1,312 feet, and as wide as 23 London buses parked next to each other. The ship displaces 265,876 tonnes. Now that's as much as 130 World War II era American Fletcher-class destroyers or 5 Titanics. The sheer scale of the thing is hard to comprehend, and just as you start to get your mind around it, you then realise that it can hit speeds of up to 22.8 knots or 26.2 miles per hour. That's more than 40 kilometres per hour. And when something that big is moving at the speed of a family car in a small city street, it's no wonder that occasionally accidents can happen. But how do you even stop a ship the size of the Ever Given? How long does it even take to slow down from top speed, and how on earth are these beasts of the ocean controlled at all? Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs, and this is how ships stop at sea. Ships are often lauded for their speed. Since the early days of sail, the amount of sails a ship could carry and the lines of its hull could dictate just how quickly that vessel could cross the world's oceans. Now, obviously this was important for many different reasons, be they escaping enemy warships in combat, or privateers, the state-sanctioned pirates that would hunt the valuable merchant ships down. Even just delivering things on time, shaving off days or weeks to a long voyage, is something we might now take for granted. Bringing a sailing ship like that to a stop, either on approach to port or maybe to render assistance at sea, was usually a matter of heaving to, where the wind is being driven head-on against the forward side of one of the main sails, and the ship can be driven into the wind to stop any forward momentum at all. A variation of this is used as a quick emergency stop to respond to man-overboard situations on sailing ships to this day. But once powerful steam engines were implemented on ships in the early 1800s, it changed the game entirely. With the introduction of iron and steel-hulled vessels, ships suddenly became way bigger than they had been during the glory years of sail, from 2,000 to 20,000 tons, and, equipped with massive expansion steam engines, these ships were generating a lot of forward momentum. By Titanic's day, the ocean liner was prized for its speed, and ships raced across the Atlantic to set records for the shortest crossings, but bringing these ships to a stop was no simple task. We all know the Titanic's stopping capabilities were really tested on the night of April 14th, 1912, when the ship encountered its infamous iceberg. But emergency stopping was a standard procedure that was tested during Titanic Sea Trials just a couple of weeks earlier. The Sea Trials are the standard tests of a brand new ship that are conducted to check that it performs adequately before the final product is officially handed over from builder to new owner. Now, Titanic underwent about 12 hours of tests, which monitored how well she could turn and get up to speed, but the trials also put her under a crash stop or an emergency stop. Now, the basic principle was to reverse the ship's engines from full ahead to full astern. By reversing the engines, the propeller's direction would, of course, also reverse, and the pitch or angle of the ship's fixed propeller blades would then begin to act as a kind of braking force as the ship plunged ahead at its top speed of 21 knots. That's 24 miles per hour, or just shy of 39 kilometers per hour. Now, with the engines suddenly thrown into reverse, Titanic's 52,000-ton bulk was still surging ahead, and it would take a good amount of time, or rather distance, for the propellers to be able to bring the ship to a stop. Now, that much momentum, going at that much speed, is monstrously difficult to bring under control, let alone halt entirely. It took Titanic 3 minutes and 15 seconds to come to a stop, having travelled some 850 yards, or a full 777 metres. Now, that's 3 times the ship's own length. Now, this does sound like a huge distance, and it is to some extent, but all things considered, as you will soon find out, that's actually quite impressive. She could stop at nearly full speed in under a kilometre and far less than a mile. If a passenger fell overboard, the ship would stop only 3 ship lengths away, meaning recovery of the passenger was quite probable. In normal operations, Titanic should have been equipped to deal with almost all emergencies, but of course, on that moonless night she encountered the iceberg, the crew simply didn't have enough time to react. In fact, the most recent evidence suggests that Titanic's first officer, William Murdoch, wasn't trying to bring Titanic to a complete crash stop by reversing the engines. He simply ordered them to stop, possibly planning to slow the ship's progress, but to use its massive forward momentum to glide around the iceberg. Tragically, they almost made it. Of course, things have changed since Titanic's day, and ships are almost inconceivably larger. Ever Given, that we saw earlier, is 5 times bigger than Titanic. So how do ships like that handle at sea? Well, of course, it all comes down to their propulsion. Surprisingly, big ships like Ever Given usually only have one engine and one propeller, but it's not just any engine. Ever Given has a Mitsui MAN B&W diesel engine that outputs 59,300 kilowatts of raw power. Now, engines like this have almost ridiculous specifications, and if you're into like motors or engines or anything at all, this will blow your mind. A 950mm or 37.4-inch bore, 3460mm or 136-inch stroke, outputting up to 6,800 kilowatts per cylinder. Now, if you're not into engines, suffice it to say, those are some pretty impressive numbers. Back in Titanic's day, reciprocating steam engines of similar size could generate about 15,000 horsepower compared to Ever Given's 79,500. Now, it's enough to push that ship through the water at 22.8 knots. Now, bringing a ship like this to an emergency stop is no easy task. In fact, performing emergency stops puts a huge amount of strain on the engines, the propellers and their shafts, and especially the thrust block assembly. The thrust block is the device that actually harnesses the propeller's thrust and transfers it into the hull of the ship itself, rather than allow the force to push straight through the engine. Of course, getting something in excess of 220,000 tons to stop in record time, with the engines now suddenly running at full speed in reverse, will put a massive strain on the entire assembly. In fact, tests show that it's actually better, if time and distance allow it, to simply reduce the engine speed, like downshifting on a car, in steps and throwing the wheel hard over with each step, the action of which will naturally bleed speed off and take pressure off the machinery. But for a proper emergency crash stop, a fully laden modern bulk carrier can take as little as 1.3 miles or 2 kilometers to as much as 3.8 miles or 6 kilometers to come to a stop. Now, this is all to do with the inertia and the sheer mass of modern cargo ships which displace all those hundreds of thousands of tons of water. To that end, when a modern large cargo ship is approaching its destination, it will begin to slow down 50 miles or 80 kilometers away from its destination port. Now, this means that the ship will be at a very slow and controllable speed once it finally arrives, where a pilot, who's a trained specialist, whose job it is to actually guide the ship into any unfamiliar harbour, can easily step aboard, and then tugboats can rush out and take the ship under control and actually maneuver it into the port. Now, even simply stopping the engines without reversing them on a large bulk carrier, a maneuver known as an inertia stop, will mean the massive forward momentum of the ship could take over 11 miles or 17.7 kilometers to stop it. But for day-to-day operations of big ships, it's actually absolutely imperative that the vessel doesn't stop at all in busy waters. A ship needs some speed, called headway, to be able to actually maneuver themselves in the first place. Without that bit of headway, the ship could become uncontrollable and not respond to rudder commands. Tugboats will come alongside big ships and guide them into harbour at speeds in excess of 5 knots. Any less than this, and big ships like tankers would be incapable of manoeuvring themselves into turns. Now, in the case of emergencies on the approach to harbours, modern ships can execute a last-minute stopping procedure called emergency anchoring. Now, of course, these can't be used in the open ocean where it's too deep, but in the shallow of a harbour, in the event of an emergency, the engines can be thrown into full astern or reverse, and the anchors could be dropped where they, and more importantly their massive, heavy chains, would drag along the sea floor and act like a brake to bring the ship to a stop in record time. Now, obviously this puts a monumental strain on the machinery and the winches which are designed to handle the anchors, and it's extremely dangerous for any crew nearby. But in an emergency, it would be better to damage the machinery than lose the ship. Now, this actually happened in 2002. A fully loaded tanker was coming into port, but her draft had been incorrectly recorded. The uneven trim, which resulted in a half-metre more draft forward, resulted in the ship not responding to rudder commands below 5 knots. Putting the engines astern appeared to not do anything. Now, it seemed like a collision with the dock might be unavoidable, so the pilot ordered the ship's anchors let go, but only partially. His order wasn't followed, and the anchors were actually let completely out. With just 10 meters or 33 feet to spare, the ship drew to a halt, and a collision was narrowly avoided. Now, that's all well and good, but it may surprise you to know that in the past, tests were actually run on fitting actual brakes to the sides of ships. Back in the early 1900s, the US Navy's warships had suddenly exploded in size, reaching up to 25,000 tons and beyond. Their massive battleships were very difficult to control and stop, and solutions were sought to make it easier for the crews. Ship brakes had actually been patented in the 1870s and fitted to smaller vessels, but at the turn of the century, clerk and would-be inventor Louis Lacoste came up with a large, advanced brake designed for bigger ships. The idea was to fit the ship with a kind of massive door, one on each side, which would normally sit flush with the hull, but which could be extended outwards and interrupt the flow of water. Tests on a small Canadian steamer of 250 tons, the Eureka, could bring it to a stop in less than 100 feet. Now, the US Navy was dubious of this invention to say the least, but thanks to Lacoste's political connections, President Theodore Roosevelt ordered the invention to be tested on the USS Indiana, a battleship. Now, tests proved dismal. Not only did it fail to bring the ship to a short stop, but over time it could easily become clogged with marine growth and slow the ship down when it wasn't meant to. But critically, it also added a lot of unnecessary weight. Now, a newspaper reported that officers of the Navy have very little regard for the brake. The idea was dropped, and that was the effective end of the ship brake. So there you have it. In normal operation, modern-day heavy vessels will begin to slow down many miles away from their destination, but in an emergency, it can still take them a long way to come to a stop. If you're a small boat owner, or you fancy taking your tinny fishing boat out on the weekend, it might be a good reminder to stay out of shipping lanes, because if you're accidentally straying into their path and they start a crash stop from miles away, chances are they will still cruise right over the top of you. So maybe keep clear. Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Ocean Liner Designs. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel because we get new videos out weekly. If you want to support my work and get really cool perks like behind the scenes and early access, please visit my Patreon in the link in the description below, or sign up as a YouTube member. Come and join the crew. As always, stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you again next time.